There was a locked room in the basement of our first house. It took us almost 10 weeks to get that door open. And when we finally did, what we found inside wasn't what scared me. What scared me was realizing the sound we'd been hearing every night for 2 months had been coming from a room that, according to everything we could find, hadn't been opened in over 15 years. Daniel and I had been renting for 6 years before we finally saved enough for a down payment. We found a house on Coldwater Lane, a modest 3-bedroom built in the late 1980s, priced a little under what similar houses in the area were going for. The listing said, "Motivated sellers, quick close preferred," which we didn't think much of at the time. The sellers were an older couple who barely spoke during the walkthrough, letting the realtor do most of the talking. When I asked why they were selling, the wife said simply, "It's time for us to move on," and didn't elaborate. I didn't think anything of it. People sell houses for all kinds of reasons. We closed in April. I remember the first weekend in that house felt exactly like it was supposed to. Pizza on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, paint samples taped to the living room wall, that particular kind of tired happy you get from finally having something that's yours. The house had a finished basement, mostly empty when we moved in, except for a single door at the far end that the realtor had described as just storage. Old owners kept some boxes down there. The door had a lock on it, an old-fashioned kind, and no key had been included with the house. Daniel tried to force it open during our first week, mostly out of curiosity, but it didn't budge. He eventually gave up, said we'd deal with it later, maybe call a locksmith once we had time. I started noticing, within the first month, that the basement was colder than it should have been. Colder than felt right, even accounting for it being underground. I mentioned it to Daniel. He agreed but chalked it up to the age of the house, maybe a poorly insulated section near that door. About 3 weeks in, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a scraping sound coming from below our bedroom, which sat directly above the basement. It sounded like something being dragged slowly across a concrete floor. I woke Daniel. He listened for a minute, said it was probably just the house settling, and went back to sleep. I lay awake for almost another hour, listening, before the sound eventually stopped on its own. The next morning, I went down to check, mostly to reassure myself. Everything was exactly where it had been. Nothing moved, nothing out of place. The locked door at the end was still locked, same as always. I did notice one thing that morning that I didn't mention to Daniel right away. There was a thin line of frost on the concrete floor, running in a straight path from the base of the stairs directly to the locked door. Not scattered condensation, but a single deliberate-looking line, like something had dragged itself across the floor and left the cold behind it. By the time I went back down that evening to show him, it had melted, and I started to wonder if I'd imagined the shape of it. Over the following 2 weeks, the sound came back 4 more times, always between 1 and 3 a.m., always the same slow, deliberate scraping. I started keeping a note on my phone, the date, the time it started, how long it lasted. I told myself I was just being thorough. Looking back, I think some part of me already understood I was building a case for something I didn't want to say out loud yet. The pattern that emerged unsettled me more than any single night had. The sound never came on nights when we'd had visitors over, and never on nights when we'd left a light on in the basement stairwell. It was almost as if whatever it was preferred to be unseen and unheard by anyone but us, and only when the house was fully dark and fully quiet. I didn't say any of this to Daniel yet. I wasn't ready to hear him tell me I was reading patterns into random noise. A few weeks later, I was outside gardening when our next-door neighbor, a woman named Diane who'd lived on the street for over 20 years, came over to introduce herself properly for the first time. We talked for a while, normal small talk, the kind you have with new neighbors. At one point she asked, in a tone I describe as oddly careful, how we were finding the house. I said fine, that we loved it, though I mentioned, mostly making conversation, that the basement got surprisingly cold sometimes. Diane went quiet for a second, then said, "The Whitfields kept that basement door locked the whole time they lived there too." Then she changed the subject to something about the neighborhood's upcoming block party, and I didn't get the chance to ask what she meant before she excused herself back to her own yard. I couldn't let the comment go. I spent an evening searching online for anything about the previous owners, the Whitfields, and their time in that house. I didn't find much. A few old public records confirming they'd owned the house for almost 18 years before selling. No news articles, no obituaries, nothing dramatic or conclusive. Just a name and a timeline that didn't tell me anything about the locked door or the cold basement. I mentioned it to Daniel, who told me I was reading too much into an offhand comment from a neighbor we'd only just met. I wanted to believe that. Some part of me did believe that, most days. About 2 months in, Daniel experienced the sound himself for the first time. On a night I'd gone to bed early with a headache. He told me the next morning that he'd heard the same dragging sound I'd described, except that time it hadn't stayed confined to the basement. He said it had sounded briefly like it was coming from directly behind the locked door, and then, a moment later, like it had moved to the base of the basement stairs. He admitted he hadn't gone down to check. He said he'd sat in the living room with the lights on until it stopped, which took almost 20 minutes. That was the first time I saw Daniel genuinely rattled by it, rather than dismissing it the way he usually did. We finally called a locksmith about 10 weeks after moving in, mostly at my insistence. I needed to know what was actually behind that door, even if it turned out to be nothing. The locksmith had trouble with it, said the lock mechanism was older and more heavily rusted than he'd expected for a door that size, more like something meant to keep a room permanently sealed than a simple storage closet. It took him almost 45 minutes longer than he'd quoted. When the door finally opened, the room behind it was smaller than I expected. Maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, bare concrete, no furniture, no boxes, nothing at all except a single child's shoe sitting in the center of the floor. Neither of us touched it at first. It looked old, worn, a style I didn't recognize from anything current, like it had been sitting there for a long time. Daniel eventually picked it up, mostly out of the same impulse that makes you pick up anything unexplained. He said it felt exactly like what it looked like. An old, slightly dusty child's shoe, nothing more. We didn't have an explanation for it. The realtor hadn't mentioned any children associated with the Whitfields. I almost called Diane to ask, then decided against it, unsure I wanted to hear whatever the answer might be. That night, after we'd left the shoe sitting on the kitchen counter, I woke up sometime after midnight to find Daniel wasn't in bed. I found him standing at the top of the basement stairs, just standing there, not moving, staring down into the dark. When I asked what he was doing, it took him a few seconds longer than it should have to answer. He said he thought he'd heard someone say something from down there. He wouldn't tell me what. He said it wasn't words exactly, just a tone, like someone talking very quietly to themselves. Neither of us went down to check. The following morning, the shoe wasn't where we'd left it on the counter. It was sitting on the second stair from the bottom of the basement steps, facing upward toward the kitchen door. About 2 weeks after the shoe moved on its own, on a night I remember specifically because it was close to the 1-year anniversary of when we'd first gotten the keys, the sound changed for the first time. Instead of the usual dragging, it sounded faintly like something being set down gently, over and over in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Nothing violent or aggressive about it, just steady and deliberate, almost careful. Daniel and I lay in bed together, not speaking, until it stopped on its own sometime before dawn. Neither of us went down to check that night. I remember thinking, lying there, that the sound almost reminded me of someone setting a small object down again and again, testing where it belonged. Within a few days, the activity stopped staying confined to that one room. I woke up one night to the sound of soft footsteps crossing the hallway just outside our bedroom door. Not heavy, not rushed, more like someone walking carefully so as not to be heard. I lay frozen, listening to them pass our door and continue toward the back of the house, toward the room we'd set aside as a nursery someday, still mostly empty except for a single dresser we hadn't filled yet. The footsteps stopped outside that room, then nothing. I didn't have the nerve to get up and look. The next morning, I found the dresser drawer in that room open about 2 inches, though I was certain we'd left it closed. Daniel said he must have left it that way and forgotten. I didn't argue with him, but I remembered checking that drawer myself the day before, out of an old habit of double-checking things, and I remembered it being shut. A few nights later, I woke to a different sound entirely. A low, almost tuneless humming coming from somewhere in the house, too faint to place exactly. It wasn't words. It wasn't quite a melody either. More like someone quietly occupying themselves with a sound the way a person hums absent-mindedly while doing something else. I woke Daniel that time. He heard it too, and for the first time, neither of us pretended it was something explainable. We lay there together, listening, until it faded out on its own after several minutes. The following week, I noticed a cold spot had developed at the top of the basement stairs. Not the basement itself this time, but the doorway leading down to it, a spot maybe 2 feet across that stayed noticeably colder than the surrounding hallway, no matter the season or the thermostat setting. I only found it because I walked through it barefoot one morning and it stopped me in my tracks. At that point, I went back to researching, this time more deliberately than my first half-hearted search months earlier. I visited the local library and asked one of the archivists if they had old newspaper records going back a few decades for our area. It took most of an afternoon, but I found a short article, barely more than a paragraph, mentioning a family named Whitfield on Coldwater Lane, referencing a private family loss that the article didn't elaborate on, along with a date. The date lined up almost exactly with what would have made their daughter roughly 3 or 4 years old, based on rough math from what the wife had implied to me during our earlier phone call. There was no cause of death listed, no further detail, just a name, a street, and a date that matched an age young enough to explain a small child's shoe. I sat with that clipping for a long time before deciding what to do next. I eventually found a working phone number for the Whitfields through the real estate agent, who still had a forwarding contact on file. I called, keeping the conversation light at first, said we'd found some things during a basement cleanup, wanted to know if any of it belonged to them. There was a long pause before the woman on the line asked, carefully, if we'd found anything in the small room. I said yes, a child's shoe. Another long pause followed. She eventually said quietly that they'd had a daughter many years before their older children were born and that she passed away very young. She said they didn't like discussing it and that the room had originally belonged to her before it was later repurposed as storage. I told her, gently, that we'd also been hearing things in the house. Footsteps, humming, sounds we couldn't explain. She went quiet for a moment, then said only that she wasn't surprised and that they'd experienced similar things themselves, though she didn't want to go into further detail. She didn't offer more, and I didn't feel right pushing for it. After that call, Daniel and I talked for a long time about what to do. We eventually cleaned out the small room properly, repainted it, and put the shoe in a small box on a shelf inside, rather than throwing it away, which felt wrong to both of us, for reasons neither of us could fully explain. We also left a small nightlight on in the hallway near the nursery room from then on, and started leaving the basement stairwell light on overnight, every night, without really discussing why. The activity became noticeably less frequent after that. The footsteps stopped almost entirely. The humming came only rarely, maybe once every few weeks instead of several times a week. The cold spot at the top of the stairs never fully went away, but it never spread further either. I don't know if any of what we did actually mattered, or if it would have settled on its own regardless. I've stopped trying to decide for certain. Daniel and I sold the house about 2 years later, for reasons unrelated to any of this, a job opportunity in another state. Before we left, I went into that small room alone one last time. I've never told anyone, not even Daniel, exactly what I said in there. We're settled somewhere else now, and as far as I know, nothing like this has followed us. But I still won't talk about that house for long, even now. And I still keep that small shoe, boxed, somewhere in a closet I don't open often. I don't have an explanation for any of it. I just know what I heard, what we found, and what that phone call told us. Some of it I've made peace with not understanding.